Welcome to a mid-year wrap-up video. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and while this was initially going to be a book binge episode on the main channel where I talked about some of my favorite reading experiences of the year so far, I decided it would make more sense to combine this with, a similar video that might have come out on the second channel talking about the non-book related stuff that I've enjoyed so far in 2026. However, for, a mid-year sort of thing, I just kind of thought that it would make more sense to combine these two videos together, use the collaboration feature and display it between both of my channels, since I would cover all of these different topics between the both of them, but, only one video should suffice, I think. So what all am I going to cover? Well, on the book side of things, I'm going to talk about 10 to 12 books here, depending on how you want to count and separate those books. I'm going to talk about 5 games that I've played, 7 movies that I've watched, and then also a handful of albums as well that I've listened to, and might cover those slightly more in depth than some of the other topics, just because I've more or less given up on covering music on the second channel at this point. Like I said, just one video shared between the two channels to cover all the stuff all at once, and that should suffice. Do note, for the actual coverage of the items, this isn't a ranking or anything. I'm not actually placing these in any particular order in that sense, but I'm not just doing it willy-nilly. There's kind of a curation that I've got going on for each of these sections, where I've grouped a few things up into a few different categories in either case, and then within each of those curated categories, basically, I've listing the items in order of when I experience them for the most part. There's one exception to that rule, but that's basically how I have organized this list. So, without further ado, because this introduction is probably longer than it should be, and this video is probably going to be longer than I intend it to be, I'm basically going to do this in the same order that I do my bi-weekly update videos between these channels. So that'll be doing the books, games, then films, and then I'll follow that up with the music at the very end. You can use the timestamps or the links in the description basically to go to whichever sections you are actually curious about. But that means that we are going to start off with the books, and I will start here with the 4 books that actually ended up becoming favorites of mine at this point. So these 4 books did make it up onto the updated Casey canon. I did a video on the main channel recently that talked about my favorite books of all time, updated as of the end of May 2026. That video just came out a week or two ago at this point, and these 4 books ended up on that list. So first off, in January, I did read The Three Musketeers, which became a personal favorite for surprising reasons, really. I don't think this book is as tight as The Count of Monte Cristo is, another Dumas novel, but this one connected with me a little bit more, especially the very end, essentially the last few lines of this book, not counting the one-page epilogue that follows it, are some of the most impactful lines I've ever experienced. Definitely my favorite close to a book I've ever read, and it really hit me hard at a time when I needed it. My review of that book explains a little bit more of that story. I don't need to go into it here, because though that was my longest individual book review that I've posted, so that would take a little bit too much time. I also read Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World by Haruki Murakami in January as well, and frankly, my review of this book did not do the book justice at all. I feel like that's probably, well, it's not my worst review, but it's definitely one of my worst reviews, largely because I had a very difficult time actually putting together coherent thoughts and justifications for why I enjoyed the book, what made it great and why it connected with me so much. Definitely one of those experiences that just, really defines my reading experience this year, broad scale book that really clicked in all the right ways and all the right times, but which I can't really explain with any quote unquote objective measure. Just suffice to say, I really, really adored this book. Next, I also read in March, Perfume, The Story of a Murderer by Patrick Suskind, and really enjoyed this as well. This one I can quantify why I enjoyed it a lot, and that's largely because of the prose. There's not a whole lot of books that really dedicatedly focus on prose as the main driving factor of the experience, and usually when they do, it feels kind of ham-fisted in some sense. Purple prose is a thing that people talk about sometimes. in the case of Perfume, it's one that like actually tonally is done with a purpose. You know, it's not just writing in such a beautiful way for the sake of writing in such a beautiful way. It's more so using, you know, as the title may imply, the sense of scent in order to convey a lot of what is actually being done in the book tonally. Like, it might not make much sense putting it that way, but if you read the book, you'll probably understand if you're somebody who's very sensitive to smell to a certain regard. I have a buddy who actually worked in a perfume shop or something along those lines, where there's a section of this book that has some of those scents and things explained in it that really connected with him. For example, he was just like, wow, that's all really accurate and stuff. So if that's an experience that you're interested in trying, because yeah, that prose goes into scent in such an authentic way, in a way that was really, really great and interesting to read, I recommend giving it a shot for that. I really loved it for that, for sure. And then in April, I read The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell, which is maybe the most devastating book I've ever read, if I'm being honest with you. It asks a timeless spiritual question that is frankly a difficult one to answer in a lot of regards, and a justified question in a certain sense as well, and does so from such an objective and nuanced vantage that frankly I don't think is possible to do anywhere else. I don't know if there is another book that could or has or will ever be able to match what this did with regards to just how well it genuinely explored a spiritual question without ever imposing like the author's own view of things on you. And that really impressed me. It also happened to be one that resonated with me as well. So this one really hit for emotional reasons, and kind of opposite emotional reasons than the Three Musketeers did. So I had a couple books that I really enjoyed largely for their reading experiences here, with these two books, Murakami and the Zuskind, and then the Russell and the Dumas I enjoyed for more emotional reasons. So there's a good bit of variety between these four books. None of these books are even remotely the same as one another as well, so that's something that's always really nice. Now, the next few of these books that I'm going to talk about, you probably just saw the corners of a couple of them there, are going to be books that I also really enjoyed, that were highlights of my year so far this year, but did not necessarily make my personal canon so far. So the first couple of these, this is where one of the technicalities comes in. I'm going to talk about both The Gathering Storm and A Memory of Light, even though I'm basically counting these as one item for the purpose of the list. I did finish reading The Wheel of Time this year with these two books, and obviously the one that comes in between them, plus a few bonus materials as well that I read after the fact, and really, really had a great time with these books. The Gathering Storm reminded me of when I was reading, you know, The Wheel of Time a couple of years ago, and some of those favorite books early in the series that I really liked reminded me of what all of those were doing in the way that I enjoyed them. That was something that was really important to me, quite frankly, and made for really great escapism immediately after reading Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World, which was itself really great and necessary escapism for me at the time that I read it. And so just ended up being something that I really enjoyed. Excuse me. And then A Memory of Light was also a book that, you know, impacted me in a great way, because, you know, it was 3 years that it took me to read the series, and finally finishing it up and reading a book this large in only 9 days kind of goes to show the degree to which I actually enjoyed reading that book and like was just going through it. It was a really great time. Glad to have read The Wheel of Time. I'm really happy about how the series finished off in almost every regard, and these two books being part of that reading experience this year were a big part of that for sure. Next up, I want to give a shout out to a short fantasy book, Penance of Blood, the first book in Oathbreaker by A.J. Drummond, which was a really nice surprise hit. If you want something that's got really great dark fantasy stuff going on that isn't just relying on a bunch of stereotypes, Penance of Blood is a really great thing to give a shot, because it has a lot of familiarity with it tonally and with some of the things that it's utilizing and borrowing from, but utilizes those things in a unique way, a dynamic way that fits the personal narration and style of the the main character, the actual narrator of the book. And the fact that this is so short, it's less than 300 pages or barely 300 pages, I forget, for what otherwise would be considered a high fantasy book, is definitely something worth noting. And even though it is just the first of multiple arcs within the series, it is an essentially self-contained arc all on its own. So a really great thing to give a shot. And, even though I was in a particular period of time where I was struggling to read while I was reading it, it honestly made for some of my favorite, like, darker fantasy stuff that I've experienced. I haven't read a ton of dark fantasy, but this was really great. Another book that I want to give a surprising shout out is actually Roadwork by Stephen King, when he was writing under the name of Richard Bachman back in the day, and loved Roadwork. Actually, I was very surprised. The reason why this is a highlight of my year is because it was really evocative and honestly more emotionally captivating than I expected it to be. It reminded me of some of the more thematic things about rage that are actually really solid if you take the time to think about them a little bit more, and it utilizes some of those themes in a much more mature way, and then also reminds of like kind of being in conversation with The Shining a little bit as far as like an insane main character may go, and my review of this book also talks about a couple of those things a little bit more in depth, but I really enjoyed Roadwork. I went into it thinking that I wouldn't like it, because I started it a handful of years ago and implicitly DNF'd it at the time. I went into it with not very high hopes this time, and it really surprised me. So that surprise is a big part of the reason why I'm shouting it out today. Another thing that I wasn't sure if I would enjoy was starting to read Discworld this year. So I'm currently, at the time of recording this video, in the middle of the third book of the series, but so I've read the first two, The Color of Magic and The Light Fantastic, and The Light Fantastic in particular is definitely a highlight of my reading year so far. As far as just like sheer fun and like laugh out loud kind of stuff goes, I have actually found the humor in Discworld so far to be something that has really worked for me. And even though humor isn't the only thing that Discworld as a series does, these first couple of books are definitely geared towards a lot of one-liners and punchlines, even extended jokes that go over multiple pages sometimes, and a lot of the fun of that experience and the particular satire of these first couple books really worked for me. The Light Fantastic in particular was definitely one I wanted to note for this. So those are basically all of the main books that I wanted to talk about, those 8/technically 9 entries. But I do have a couple other reading experiences this year that I wanted to give a shout out as well. I have done a little bit of theological reading this year. I started properly reading through the Bible again. And although I'm not quite through the Torah, I probably would have collected the Torah as like one item for today's video. But because I haven't finished that, I decided to just put Genesis as the mention for this, because a lot of the stories in Genesis are really great and interesting ones, and some of them that honestly connected in ways even more so than when I first enjoyed them back a handful of years ago when I went through the first few books of the Torah a handful of years ago. So that was a reading experience I really enjoyed back in March, was going through Genesis, and then also basically right in the middle of my read through of Genesis was going through and reading First Enoch, one of the deuterocanonical books, if you consider the Ethiopian canon as part of the secondary canon. Since it is a canon, that's what I'm considering it. So First Enoch I also read back in March, and that was honestly probably the most like interesting theological read that I've done so far this year, as far as, its association with some of the other books of the actual scripture, depending on who you ask, and a lot of the topics that it goes into, some of the implicit theology, quote unquote, that is in there is just a lot of really interesting, thought-provoking stuff that I personally had a great time with, and really enjoyed myself with back at the time. And then I would also be remiss not to mention, as like the 12th, basically the asterisk item here to close out the list, I suppose, reading the first part of The Smoke of Sacrifice, Christopher Rocchio's new book that he's writing, since I work for him now, and part of that has been, working on different stuff for Doomsong amidst other projects, but Doomsong has been a big part of that the last couple of months. Reading the first part of that has been definitely a highlight of my reading year so far. But that's going to end off my discussion of books and stuff that I've enjoyed so far this year. I want to talk about some games and films that I've enjoyed so far this year as well. But for the sake of actually getting this video out on time, because I'm just recording this the evening before it's supposed to come out, I got a bit lazy the last couple days. I have to break out the green screen and switch over to my Fortnite on the Isle scene because I already have editing stuff in place for post-production to make actually showing the covers of the films and games I'm going to talk about a million times easier. So let me switch that up real quick. All right, to start off with some of the games, I want to talk about a few games that I fully experienced for the very first time so far this year. First one of those being Alan Wake back in early February, which was a really interesting experience. You know, it is kind of book related, ironically enough, but definitely an interesting experience for a lot of the story stuff going on. Really cool ideas that are unique and quite frankly sometimes a bit hard to understand at certain moments as well, but definitely an experience that I found to be very memorable and which I actually just recently went back, and I didn't think I would go through and play the game on nightmare difficulty, let alone go for the platinum afterwards, but I decided to do that recently. At the time of recording this video, I just finished doing that like yesterday actually, so I had honestly more fun doing that than I expected to overall with Alan Wake. You know, the best 7 out of 10 or 6 out of 10 game that I've ever played. Like there's a lot of issues with it, but a lot of really cool stuff that like you have to give it props for. So I really enjoyed that this year. I also really enjoyed the one new release that I'm going to talk about in depth today, I suppose. That'll be Reanimal from the developers of the original 2 Little Nightmares games. Reanimal was really good, you know, a bit on the shorter side, especially relative to some of the price point going on, but not so egregious as Little Nightmares 3 was. From a different developer. Reanimal was really good. Great spiritual successor. Not even a spiritual successor, actually. More like an evolution from the Little Nightmares format that does many of the same things, but is able to do so with some different ideas involved, since it's a different world, different lore, and stuff going on. Just a lot of really cool ideas and set pieces in there, and I really enjoyed my time with Reanimal the handful of times that I played through that, actually. So, you know, that was another highlight of the year. And I also played through BioShock 2, which I did pretty much immediately after Alan Wake, because I recorded my Let's Plays of both of those games more or less back to back, like over the course of a week or something like that. It was a heck of a workload that I put on myself early in the year, but BioShock 2 was a lot more enjoyable of experience than I expected. I think there's a lot to be desired from a story front, and even from a gameplay front as well, because it doesn't like evolve the gameplay of BioShock 1 very much, outside of a couple of like small things for the most part, more like quality of life things than anything else, which surprised me, but that meant that I enjoyed playing it, because I really enjoyed BioShock 1 back a handful of years ago when I first played that, and then BioShock 2 I also went through and was like, I'm not sure if I'm going to play this game on hard just to get the platinum, and I did immediately afterwards as well. Kind of the same story as Alan Wake there, and I think I enjoyed both of those games more upon replaying them in that way than I did the first time, so both of those were definitely highlights for me this year. Next up, a couple more games that are, you know, essentially new experiences for me this year, but based on technicalities. The first one of those being Grime 2, which I haven't actually played. I only played the demo of that back, you know, a week or two before the full game actually released, intending to play the full game more or less immediately upon release, but there was a lot of stuff going on around that time. I think that was the turn from March into April, and that was around the time that like ramping up into getting hired and some other stuff like that. Couple of trips that I ended up needing to take for a couple of things. One of those I will talk about here pretty momentarily, actually, kind of got in the way of certain things, and gaming took a very huge back seat for like a month and a half or something like that. Maybe even close to 2 months or whatever. So I haven't had time to go back and play through the entirety of Grime 2 yet. But I did really enjoy the demo when I played that. Thought that it was basically like, you know, Grime too. It was a difference and an evolution in a way that not many studios tend to go for, where it is essentially the same game, but where the tone and the theme of it is different enough that it feels like a completely different title at the same time. Really enjoyed that for sure. And then the other thing that I have spent a lot of time recently, right before I went and got the platinum for Alan Wake, I went and I actually got the platinum for Far Cry 6, but what I mostly want to shout out as far as Far Cry 6 goes is the few DLC chapters, I guess, that kind of associate with the 3 previous games. So Insanity from Voss's mind, Control from Pagan's mind, and then Collapse from Joseph/Father's mind that relate to the villains of the 3 previous games, which I haven't played yet, so I probably got a lot of implicit spoilers from those 3 DLC, but I really, really enjoyed these DLC. You know, they're all the same as one another. You're doing basically the exact same loop, at least a handful of times between all 3 of them, with the only real difference being like the map that you're actually playing on, basically, and then a couple of the gameplay scenarios within will be a little bit different, obviously, based off of the fact that they're on different maps and different characters and stuff associated with them. But this DLC, I actually really enjoyed it. I didn't really like the dedicated DLC of Lost Between Worlds, but these 3 specific items that relate to the previous games were honestly really enjoyable and made me even more excited to eventually go back and play previous Far Cry games. So that was definitely another huge part of my year 2026, was honestly like basically doubling the amount of time that I spent in Far Cry 6 just in the last couple of weeks, and a lot of that being on these 3 DLC specifically. As for film-related stuff, what are a handful of the things that I really enjoyed on this front? Well, the first 2 movies we're going to talk about are probably the best movies that I've watched so far this year, the ones that I'm willing to give 5 out of 5 stars because I think they're incredible movies, both of which made me miserable to one degree or another. One of those was Marty Supreme, which I watched back in January. I intended to watch it back in December, but it was January when I actually got to watch it this year. Think that movie is really good. I just had a really miserable time actually watching it in the theater, but recognize that it was also really, really good. And think that that's a movie that I will eventually watch at some other point in the future again to appreciate even more when it's not going to make me miserable because of certain headspace related reasons. Marty Supreme was really good. Timothy Chalamet should have gotten more awards for his performance in that movie. And similarly, I think that the actress for Nikki in Obsession deserves literally every award that she can possibly get from this movie, because quite frankly, if she doesn't, I'm going to riot. Like, if you've seen Obsession, you know exactly why. This is probably the best movie that I will never watch again. I do not think I will ever want to watch Obsession again. And even if I do, I'm going to have to convince myself not to, because again, this is different than Marty Supreme, because this made me miserable because it's honestly a miserable movie to watch, but there's, more to it than that. Obsession is incredible. 5 out of 5, impeccable, astonishing, like flawless movie. I wanted to forget every single second of that experience after I came out of the theater. So, that kind of goes to show how I felt about that. But, both those movies, despite making me a bit, miserable while watching them, were definitely highlights of the year insofar as just how good of movies they are. The next couple of movies are definitely movies that I enjoyed watching a heck of a lot more, to one degree or another. One of those was Iron Lung, the Markiplier movie, which I don't know what kind of expectations I had going into it. Because, I'm not like a longtime Markiplier fan or anything. I've always respected him, liked him generally speaking, but I was never really a subscriber of his. And so, wasn't like super into his content or any, I wouldn't say I was going into Iron Lung with any kind of preconceived bias, because of it being Markiplier, but I was really pleasantly surprised by the movie nonetheless. I had pretty high hopes for it, but I ended up really liking it a lot. As a result of that, I guess, in spite of that, depending on how you want to view it, Iron Lung was really enjoyable. I think there are a couple aspects of it that I think give in a little bit to some excess, maybe a little bit, particularly with certain shots and cuts that, there's certain moments, certain sequences that could have been shorter, certain shots that didn't really need to be in the movie. So I think you probably could have shaved like 10 minutes off of that final runtime without losing very much. But, the caliber of skill and creativity needed to make a 2-hour movie out of literally one location is definitely a lot, actually, ironically speaking. And I think that Markiplier did so very well in Iron Lung. I think he did great acting. The direction was really great. The script was really good. And having experienced the game basically afterwards, after watching the movie, I decided I wanted to go into the movie blind. I think that movie captures the spirit of the game incredibly, and expands and touches on some of the original lore from the game in ways that I think I like better, to some degree. So that's definitely something that I really enjoyed. And then I also really enjoyed Disclosure Day, the new Steven Spielberg movie, which, the more time that passes ever since I did my review of that movie. I think that review actually came out just this past week on the second channel, but I made that video like immediately after watching it on opening weekend. And I wasn't really sure like what the hubbub was about with regard to what people were not liking about it. I knew that it had a relatively mixed reception, or more mixed than I would have expected to see based off of my experience from it. The more time that passes, I understand a little bit more some of those critiques, but definitely critiques that I personally disagree with, in the sense that I just really liked this movie, man. I thought that it was really good, and many of the critiques that, while I understand why they exist, I think are explained away in ways that are convincing enough for me personally. And then there's also the factor of, I think the movie was marketed wrong. I don't think that the intended audience was necessarily the audience that they got based off of certain different creative decisions. But I really liked Disclosure Day a lot. And then finally, just a quick, handful of films, a few films that I would say are probably the ones that I would consider my personal favorites of 2026 so far. One of those being Project Hail Mary. I really don't need to say anything about this. If you've seen the movie, you know why it's great, really good. I like this movie better than I like the book. I think it's a really, really fantastic adaptation. Loved basically everything about it. Backrooms was another movie that I honestly was kind of surprised to come out enjoying it as much as I did. This is another movie that I gave 5 out of 5 stars, not because it's perfect, but because I enjoyed it enough to be able to overlook some of the things that I had minor issues with. My review of Backrooms definitely goes a little bit more into detail with some of that, lightly touching on a couple of the spoilers now and again. I think Backrooms is awesome. Definitely like an underdog film of the year contender for me. Absolutely. Might be my favorite movie of the year, I think, so far. I'm not saying it's the best movie of the year so far, but maybe my favorite one. And then I also, I enjoyed, if you want to call it enjoyed, Passion of the Christ. That was another personal favorite of this year. I watched that for the first time around Easter season, and found it really moving, actually. It's kind of hard to say that you enjoy watching Passion of the Christ, but it was definitely one that resonated with me, that connected with me, and like I said, moved me a lot, and so I enjoyed it in that way. And there are plenty of actual, creative decisions about that, including the fact that there is no English in it. All of the dialogue is written in basically authentic, the languages of the time, basically. Definitely a commitment to the bit, so to speak, that I really heavily respect and didn't actually know about before going into the movie, or didn't remember anyway, and I think it's great. I really loved Passion of the Christ, actually, in that way. So that is all that I have for film-related stuff. Moving into album, music-related stuff, I think I'm going to go ahead and stay on this screen for this section as well, because for the same reason as, already having the facets in place, or the whatever you want to call them, in place to do the game and film stuff included over on that side of the screen, I can do the same thing for album covers probably pretty easily as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here as well. Realistically speaking, my album of the year so far list is definitely a list that could be, and maybe should be, a lot bigger, but an unfortunate thing that happened for me this year is that I've largely fallen out of love with music this year for one reason or another. I may end up making a video about that on the second channel, but, talking about the specifics of that isn't really the purpose of today's video. Suffice it to say that I have not listened to a whole ton of music this year, actually. I listened to the normal amount of new releases, all the new releases basically that I was interested in from January all the way through April, basically, although April was pretty tough with this regard. And then I did also listen to a couple of new albums that released early on in May, like that first day of May, basically. And so there's only a few items on this list. The first three of these albums I want to talk about here today, I've actually only listened to one or two times a piece, largely because of that falling out of love with music. I just haven't had occasion to go back and listen to these albums more often. Endless by Of Sulfur was a really stark standout for me because it utilized a lot of the more like blackened deathcore sound that has become very popular in the scene the last half decade, and utilized a lot of those things definitely to probably my favorite degree so far, pretty close to that, definitely the closest that any band has come since Lorna Shore, who really popularized that sound for all intents and purposes. Endless was really great with regard to that. I Guess It Was Nowhere by Above Below was another album that I really connected with, largely because it does the progressive metalcore thing to a degree that I actually enjoyed a lot more than normal, we shall say. I don't love a lot of progressive metalcore. I enjoy it a lot because it's metalcore and I'm just a big metalcore person. I have a problem when it comes to core music, but progressive metalcore doesn't often become like new favorites the vast majority of the time, and this album by Above Below was definitely one of those instances where I was listening to it and I'm just like, this is the appeal of this particular subgenre. Like if all progressive metalcore connected with me in that way, or I enjoyed as much or respected as much in the way that I did with this album, I would probably enjoy more progressive metalcore and more of it would become all-time favorites. It is definitely an album that I've wanted to go back and listen to a lot more. I've just haven't felt the drive to. One of the only new releases that I have listened to in the last few months was A Pale White Dot by Periphery. That's what this hoodie is from. It's from the merch drop related to the album. Pale White Dot definitely has in consideration for album of the year straight up, in spite of the fact that I haven't really listened to very many new albums lately at all, if any, for the most part. I think A Pale White Dot is really good. It stands out amongst Periphery's work for being able to take a sound that is very much of them and evolving it over the course of the album runtime into something that is more unique and different for them, surprisingly enough. There are some ways in which I'm not 100% sure how I feel about that, actually. Definitely an album that I need to listen to a lot more, but I just haven't gone back to listen to more of this album since then, unfortunately. Next up is another album release that is associated with a little bit of work that I did late this year, or late in last year. Sorry, English is difficult, but it's also an album that I technically did a partial review for earlier this year. That was for Immoral and Malevolent Happenings by Before I Turned. I basically edited the associated book, the companion book to this album back late last year, and was pretty into that story. I was looking forward to the continuation of the storyline from the band because I've been a fan of Before I Turn since 2018, since the day before Claustrophobic released. It became one of my favorite bands and have been one of my favorite bands since then, so Immoral and Malevolent Happenings definitely satisfied in a lot of ways. I really enjoyed that album. More relevantly, one of the trips that I took earlier this year back in April was going to the album release show, basically, for Immoral and Malevolent Happenings, getting to meet Alex in person for the first time. All of that kind of experience is kind of wrapped up into part of why I enjoyed this album so much, but I like the album because I like Before I Turn, and a lot of Before I Turn is very similar to itself. So, there's that. But really, the only album that I've listened to for the most part since mid-April, basically, is A Love I Hope Will Haunt Me Forever by Midwinter. This is absolutely going to be my album of the year. There's zero chance that it doesn't become my album of the year for many similar reasons to why All Is Beautiful Because We're Doomed by We Came as Romans became my album of the year last year, despite sitting closer to the number 5 spot for most of the year after it came out. Early on in 2026, it kind of, worked its way up gradually into becoming my very favorite of the year, or rather the one that became the most important to me. A Love I Hope Will Haunt Me Forever is another one that has become very important to me. It's a very different type of progressive metalcore than the Above Below album I talked about earlier was, but it does a lot of really dynamic and unique things with song structuring and certain instrumental ideas that set it apart from basically anything else in the metalcore genre. And that's one reason to really enjoy it from a more, objective perspective. But it's really emotionally and personally why this album has really hit for me. I'm not going to go into all the details related to it, but if you know the lyrics of the album, the title of the album, all this kind of stuff relates to, you can probably guess part of why the album has really hit for me. It's basically been the only music that I found myself wanting to listen to for the last few months. Like, from a more broad perspective, we'll say that I think like 85% of my streaming time, like my music listening time essentially so far in 2026, is just Periphery, Before I Turn, and Midwinter. And I don't believe this is an exaggeration at all. I haven't done the exact math for all three of these artists, but I did a big Periphery binge at the beginning of April, while I was on that trip for the Before I Turn concert, and basically preparing for the new album. Basically, it's a shame that I haven't listened to the new album more since then, but I did a lot of Periphery back then. I listened to a lot of Before I Turn through much of the year, preparing for that concert as well, most especially just like the month beforehand, basically. Not quite as much since then, but still been listening to a lot of Before I Turn because of that. But other than those two, Midwinter being the only thing that, like I said, has sounded good to me the last several months. I did do the math for Midwinter, and I think this album alone, this singular album, is nearly 20% of my music listening time this year, which speaks to two things. Number one, that I haven't listened to very much music this year in the first place. Number two, that I've listened to this album and nearly nothing else, especially for the last 3 months. So, if you take out the music that I listened to, like the instrumental music that I listened to for work-related projects that I was doing in April, just kind of as a background noise thing, those numbers also jump up. So relatively speaking, I've listened to basically nothing besides this one album, and that title has also kind of mentally become a subtitle, like a personal title for a particular writing project that I am messing around with, trying to write when I'm feeling okay and up enough to it. But needless to say, this section has been a lot longer than I think it needed to be to any degree, but that album has definitely been the album for me in 2026. And maybe later in the year I'll go back and actually listen to a lot of these albums that I've missed. I doubt I'll have time to. Not sure if I'll have the desire to, but I do think that this album will be like definitely one of the defining albums of the decade for me, for sure. Like I think it has a space in my favorite albums of all time at this point. I think it's pretty safe to say that much. Not entirely sure where, but some of these are topics that I might go into with a little bit more depth in a dedicated video. But for now, we're going to call this the end of this little wrap up. I guess I can actually go ahead and close my green screen and turn it off on my camera. Hello, green screen. Goodbye, green screen. Go back to the regular camera view. And end this video, basically. Thank you for watching this. If you did, I really appreciate it. Let me know what some of your favorite experiences, what some of your favorite things of the year have been so far, whether that is books, games, or films, music, like whatever it is. Even if there's some other entertainment medium that I haven't discussed today that you're really into, that you really enjoyed this year, like let me know some of that. Like, for example, I actually got into watching the NBA this year, and that's definitely been a highlight of my year. It's something that I've really enjoyed being able to do, for sure. I just didn't talk about it in this video. That's like kind of a footnote to this, I guess, at the very end, is I've also really enjoyed watching basketball this year. It's the only sport I've really ever enjoyed watching, and deciding to actually dive into that a little bit more this year has been an experience. But let me know what it is, anything that you guys are into and have enjoyed so far this year. I would be curious to hear about it. But without anything else to say, basically, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video, whatever that may be, whichever channel it is, if you decide to check out more.